The KGB opens a restaurant. The story of the Aragvi Restaurant is one of the more humanizing and realistic stories in the Cold War. Realistic in that it shows how a lot of power plays and networking actually occurred, and especially Moscow, during the time of the Soviet Union. It was essentially the KGB's Georgian restaurant, the kind of thing you would imagine Ian Fleming would have written, but it was truly written by the KGB and turned brick by brick into one of the most interesting because it's not really that important, parts of the Cold War. The Aragvi Restaurant was for a long time the only Georgian restaurant in Moscow. It was one of the very best restaurants in Moscow and operated as a kind of playhouse for the Soviet elite, notable people and the KGB. In the early 1930s, eateries were run by the state. Notably, in the early 30s, there were about 30,000 stolovayas, public canteens, in Moscow, and private eateries were completely restricted. However, as the decade continued, many policies on different things started to be relaxed somewhat, and in 1934 a wider variety of eateries, including a select number of private restaurants and cafes, were allowed to open, although this was extremely limited. As such, in 1938, when Lavrentii Beria was the security chief for the NKVD, Beria pushed for and pulled the strings behind the scenes to have a specific restaurant opened that could function as a place of entertainment and relaxation in his organization, and especially those Soviet leaders from a Georgian background. Of course, a lot of people don't seem to remember or realize that the Soviet Union was not Russia, it was the Soviet Union. People who lived under it will know how the state made a concerted effort to try to minimalize national identities. Everyone was Soviet. Although people look to Moscow and think Russia when they hear Soviet Union, most of the early leaders who became the de facto leader were not Russian. Khrushchev was from the Ukraine, Stalin was from Georgia, Brezhnev was from the Ukraine, and Beria, had he become premier instead of Khrushchev, would have also been a Georgian premier. Given how many top leaders at the time were from Georgia, in no small part due to the connections many had going back many years to Stalin, it may seem odd, but at the time there was no Georgian restaurant in Moscow. These high-level Georgian members of the Communist Party often grew homesick or longed for the cuisine that they grew up with. And as such, the Aragvi was opened and operated by the state, but to serve its bureaucracy. The extent of Beria's influence is not truly known, other than that he set the ball rolling for its creation. But people like Yuri Kobalez, who worked as a spy for the KGB, said that he was told Beria had had a strong influence over the design and oversight of the restaurant's creation, including the decor and the menus. So it was created as heritage for those in the Soviet Moscow elite from a Georgian background, but also for the NKVD, which soon became the KGB. Beria and Stalin's son Vasily were the most important and some of the most frequent patrons of the restaurant, visiting regularly to enjoy Kakheti wine in particular, among other Georgian wines on the restaurant's extensive menu. Most of the patrons initially were either active KGB agents, or over time it became a good place for retired KGB officers to hang out. Likewise, it became to be seen as a good recruiting ground for spies, with agents often holding farewell parties for colleagues going abroad or retiring. The former KGB agent for intelligence and operations against Scandinavia and Britain, Mikhail Lyubimov, said that retired KGB officers in fact made up most of the staff at the restaurant. But though you might think that it would be a good place where the KGB could talk freely, or feel they could talk freely, It quickly became an unwritten rule that if you visited Aragvi, you should assume that you were being bugged by concealed microphones. The most famous British double agent who worked for the Soviets, Kim Philby, who defected to the USSR in 1963, dined regularly at the restaurant that was just a stone's throw away from the offices of the mayor of Moscow. The restaurant was set up on the high-level Gorky Street, which since the fall of the USSR has been renamed Tverskaya Street, and as such was located in one of the best areas of the city. After Aragvi had been established for a while, it was much more than just a restaurant, but was one of the main places for the Moscow elite and the Soviet elite at large to network, rub shoulders and party. Artists, cosmonauts, movie stars, celebrated chess champions and Soviet athletes, politicians and civil servants came to be part of the Aragvi crowd, and within an ear's reach of the KGB. The building chosen by those in the Soviet authorities who set up the restaurant all the way back in 1938 was the site of a famous former hotel, and they christened the restaurant after a Georgian river. Beria himself had a room in the restaurant that was specifically reserved for his use. When you want a picture of the movers and shakers in Moscow from the late 30s all the way up to the end of the fall of the Soviet Union, Aragvi would be the place. The lyrics for the revised Soviet national anthem under Stalin's reign, written by Sergei Mikhalakov in 1943, were partially created when he was in the restaurant. One evening, when KGB officers were having a party, one of the officers unknowingly invited a lady whom he liked, who was being tailed by the KGB, as she was a US spy. The director, Andrew Tarkovsky, became a frequent customer, along with the songwriter Vladimir Vyotsky and poet Lev Rubinstein. Many Soviet movies came to film scenes in Aragvi. In addition to the star actors and directors relaxing and dining at the restaurant, a particularly noteworthy anecdote is of the director Sergei Solovyov fainting in the restaurant before the order of food was brought to their table, because he was so famished. At the time of the restaurant's creation, it was not only the first Georgian restaurant in Moscow, but one of the few places where people could get high-end cuisine. Aragvi had a 12-page menu which was filled with the very best of Georgian cuisine, much of which was specially delivered by chartered train from the Georgian capital Tbilisi. Grilled chicken with nuts and garlic, especially satsivi, cold chicken in nut sauce, a range of Georgian traditional wines, marinated meat, breads, and khinkali, Caucasian dumplings of meat and bouillon, shashlik, lobio, and caviar. The most famous Georgian himself did not dine there, somewhat ironically, because of his paranoia about security in public venues and the preparation of his food, instead having much of his home country's cuisine privately in the Kremlin or at his dachas. There is one anecdote, though, that Stalin supposedly went to Aragvi to see his childhood friend, Sergei Kavtaradze, and brought food from the restaurant as a takeaway. But other than that, it was Vasily Stalin who held court at Aragvi with Beria, often on their private balcony or rooms. Vasily was a heavy drinker, dying from alcohol poisoning in 1962, and at Aragvi he had an especial taste for Georgian red wines, imports like the one his father famously served to Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta. It's a fascinating tale of what can happen when the KGB decide to open a restaurant.